actually intend to engage in suicidal behavior. And as clergy in general, we are not equipped to make the distinction. So that idea that this person is only doing it for attention, even if that is true, if they need attention so badly, they're talking about suicide, then they need our attention, and we give it to them. And let their therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists figure out what else is going on with them. So I just want to make it clear that we never dismiss anybody talking about suicide. So we went over the risk factors, the warning signs in the earlier session. And so now you're in conversation with someone you think might be suicidal. And there are essentially 3 questions that are asked sequentially. If you think someone is thinking about suicide to one extent or another, please ask them directly. Don't hedge your bets and say, are you thinking of hurting yourself? That's a whole different question these days. You want to ask directly, are you thinking of suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? If you are uncomfortable asking that question, find someone who can ask it directly. I hope as clergy, we're all able to ask that directly, but I understand we all have our stuff. So if you cannot ask it directly, please find someone who can. So you want to say, are you thinking about suicide? Do you have thoughts on killing yourself? If the person says yes, your next question is, do you have a plan? Not what is your plan. Trust me, you don't need that stuff in your head. It will give you nightmares. If they say yes, then the next question is, do you have access to the means? Again, we don't ask what they are. We simply say, do you have them, or do you have access to the means? Mostly because you don't need that stuff in your head. It's traumatizing. The one caveat I'll put on this is when you're thinking someone's thinking of suicide, if it's someone you know well who struggles with suicidality, you can ask them if these thoughts are new or somehow different from previous ones. But generally speaking, clergy are not going to be in a position to ask that question. Therapists might be. So, are you thinking about suicide? Do you have a plan? Do you have access to the means? And now you're thinking, if the answer to all these questions is yes, what do I do? Well, let's break it down a little bit. If the person is thinking about suicide, but does not have a plan, then you have some leeway. You want to get them connected with mental health services. You want to get them to an existing therapist or help them get an appointment soon. Like that same day, preferably the very next day, if at all possible. If they have thoughts and a plan, then the level of intervention needed immediately goes up a little bit. Thoughts and a plan means you need to make sure they have a therapist, make sure that they're evaluated by someone, whether it's an emergency room or mental health crisis or their own personal therapist. That needs to happen. If it's all 3, then it's a serious crisis. It is likely that person will die or engage in suicidal behavior within 24 hours. So if the person has thoughts, plan, and means, you want to try to get them to either a mental health center or an emergency room or their own therapist within the hour. Sometimes if they're refusing, sometimes 911 is the best answer. I realize that treatment in emergency rooms is not optimal, but it's better they're alive and waiting in an emergency room and pissed off at you than dead. Again, the caveat I put on that is when you live in a predominantly white community and you call 911 for a person of color, make sure there is a white person there who will bear witness. Police have a lousy track record with mental health issues and people of color. So just keep that in mind. People tend not to know what to do with intervention. So it's important to know your limits. Know what you know what you don't know. Know what you can provide and what you cannot provide. Very similar to knowing your boundaries. Do not make promises that you cannot keep. Like, I will stay with you in the emergency room until you are seen by a doctor. Unless you've got 24 or 48 hours to hang out in the emergency room, don't make that promise. You can say, I'll stay with you until we can get someone else to be with you. You can say, I'll give you a ride and get you settled in and check back with you later. But don't make promises you can't keep. Don't say, you know, I'm going to meet with you twice a week from now until you feel better, because none of us have time to do that, nor are most of us qualified to do that. A psychiatric crisis can be a spiritual crisis, but it isn't always. And most of us are not qualified to go into the midst of that on a regular basis. So limits, boundaries, and know the resources of your community. Know what's available in your area. If you happen to not know what to do or where to go, you can call the National Suicide Hotline, 1-800-273-TALK. You'd think I'd know all of the numbers, but I don't. Whatever TALK is. And it's, if you Google hotline, National Suicide Hotline, you'll find it. You can call them if you're not sure what to do with someone who is imminently suicidal, and they will help you sort it out. You do not have to be suicidal yourself in order to make that call. So that's another resource that's available to you. I realize in parts of New Hampshire, there are not a lot of resources available. So, because when I worked at the state hospital as chaplain, I would get calls from some of you with people in psychiatric emergency asking what to do. So I know that there are places in New Hampshire where there are not a lot of resources, but the national hotline is always there for you. And any emergency room can receive someone who is suicidal. They may not have behavioral health beds at the hospital, but they can receive someone who is imminently suicidal. So if you need to, you can go there. All
Rachel,
right.
we got a question.
Yep.
Do you know if we can call 211 like we do for homelessness or SUD?
I honestly don't know. Try it out.
I think the answer is yes, and I see some nodding heads.
Yeah, the answer is yes. You
Okay.
can. Then ask for you can ask for a safety check or a wellness check.
Yeah, if you're not sure, if you're, especially these days, if you're not able to lay eyes on the person, you can, a safety check or a wellness check is a good idea. Know that people who are suicidal often lie, especially to those who have the authority to bring them to treatment. And sometimes police officers are not well equipped. So just bear that in mind.
Can I just say, as a pastor in a small rural town who has a relationship with the police department, I can call, explain the situation, and ask if they can send the officer who is equipped.
Yes.
There's usually one person on the force
Right.
that has more experience than others. So,
so you did, if at all possible, you want to ask for the officer who is trained to deal with mental health crisis. Most police forces have at least one, but not all. So ask them if, like in Minneapolis, there's a mental health unit on the police department, but in St. Paul, there is not. And you can't get Minneapolis police to come to St. Paul. So it's always a challenge. All right. Let's see. So we're back to the Puritans now. Because this is where it gets real for our sort of commonly held religious beliefs, is when we're intervening in suicide. It's a little real in prevention, but it gets really real in intervention. Because the commonly held beliefs around suicide can act as either protective factors or risk factors, depending on the situation. And I know that's the confusion, but bear with me and I hope to unconfuse you soon. So the commonly held belief, suicide is a sin. Anyone who dies by suicide is damned. God's grace does not extend to those who die by suicide. Common beliefs. I'm sure we have all heard these. So all of those things can be either a risk factor or a protective factor. There were many patients at the hospital who would say to me, I would kill myself, but I don't want to go to hell. To which I would respond, good. Now let's talk about the pain you're in to see if we can alleviate some of that in a way that is perhaps more pleasing to God. So if I were to say to that person, which is what we liberal progressive folks want to do, is say, oh no, God loves you no matter what. You won't go to hell. If you say that to someone who is suicidal, you have given them permission to die by suicide. And I cannot tell you how many clergy have reached out to me and said, please tell me this is not my fault. I had a conversation with a person yesterday, and they told me they were afraid of going to hell, and I assured them they wouldn't go to hell, and now they're dead. You don't want to add to that number. So when the belief in hell is a protective factor, do not undo it. Psychiatric crisis is not a time to worry about theology, right? Now, the flip side to that is that for people who are survivors of suicide loss, they have had a loved one die by suicide, and they believe that loved one is alone in hell forever. That increases the risk that they will die by suicide because they don't want their loved one to be alone in hell forever. And if they die by suicide, they can be in hell with the loved one. We're not talking logical thought here. This is just what happens. So then we think, oh, we should correct that so we minimize the risk. And we assure them their loved one's in heaven. Well, if you have lost a loved one to suicide and you are grieving and you think this pain is never going to end, and somebody says, oh, your loved one's in heaven with God, be like, sign me up, I want that. So risk factor. And so we have to be very careful about what we say and who our audience is. If someone says to you, my child died by suicide and I believe they're in heaven, the follow-up questions are, do you ever think about dying by suicide to be with them? And depending on their answer, where you go next. And then does it bring you comfort? So if it minimizes their risk for suicide and brings them comfort, you leave it alone. If it increases their risk for suicide, you can introduce the possibility that we don't really know what happens to someone who dies by suicide. We want to believe in God's mercy, but we honestly don't know. We introduce that doubt because that doubt might keep someone alive. Are you with me so far? So you see where it gets complicated and it gets very real. All right. So then what do we do with that? You know, we can't say, yeah, you're right, you're going to hell. And we can't say, no, you're going to heaven. God loves you no matter what. What do we do? This is my answer. I say unequivocally that God is not a fan of suicide. And I firmly believe this. You'll note it says nothing about God's capacity for forgiveness. It promises nothing about afterlife. It simply states the fact that God is not a fan of suicide. If we believe that God gives us life, then God would not be overly fond of the idea of saying, God, this life isn't good enough for me, take it back, which is in effect what you say when you're suicidal. So, and this argument has worked well for people who are suicidal that I have spoken with, just to introduce the idea that God would rather we resolve the psychiatric pain we're in ways that are more pleasing to God and more life-sustaining. It does not deny that the person's in pain. It does not deny their feelings about worthlessness or being a burden to family. None of that. It just says God would rather you do something else. Does that make sense? Okay. And there are reasons to say this. If we take a look at what Jesus did while on the planet in the flesh, we know that Jesus was always on the side of love and abundant life. Jesus reached out to those on the margins, those who had been pushed out of community, those who were overlooked, ignored, dismissed, viewed as unclean, and erred on the side of love. He saw their humanity, he saw the condition they were in, and he offered them abundant life in one way or another. Another way to put that is Jesus remembered people. He literally reconnected people to their community, because when Jesus healed someone, he made them clean again and enabled them to return to community. That is a literal remembering, reconnecting. And my favorite line that often gets me in trouble, God does not need our help saving souls. God needs our help saving lives. I firmly believe God has the souls thing covered, but saving lives is what the church ought to be about. If Jesus was all about remembering people, the church needs to get over its tendency to dismember people. We need to work harder on our full inclusion of people with mental health issues and suicidality. And what does that look like? I often say that you will know that you have achieved a safe, affirming, welcoming community when someone raises their hand during prayer concerns and says, "Pray for me, I'm struggling with thoughts of suicide today," and the whole congregation doesn't go, "Ugh." And there's an appropriate follow-up from pastoral care team or you as the pastor. Or someone else can say, "Pray for me, I'm having trouble sorting out the voices in my head today." And nobody's shocked, and people genuinely hold them in prayer. You will know that you have achieved a safe and welcoming community that embodies the love God intends for us to share when these things start happening in your community. And now the big question that I haven't answered: is suicide a sin? And my response is yes, but not the way you think. Suicide is not the sin of the individual. Mental illness knows no boundaries. It will strike anybody at any time. Depression is the great deceiver. The person who is struggling with these things is not the one who is sinning. Even if they choose to engage in suicidal behavior, that is not the sin. The sin is in the community, in the body of Christ, because we have failed to communicate the life-saving love God has for all of humanity. So we bear that sin as a community. The good news, we believe in a God of forgiveness and grace and mercy. And so when we get it wrong and we acknowledge that we've gotten it wrong, we can begin again, so that the next person who comes to us who struggles with these things will find that we are more life affirming and embodying that divine love than we were in the past. This is grace and mercy embodied. That makes sense? That's often hard for people to hear. Okay. I'm taking the silence or the lack of questions at this moment as you're still with me. All right. So that's intervention at its core. The most important thing you can do is to ask the direct questions. Do you have thoughts of suicide? Do you have a plan? Do you have access to the means? Those are the most important life-saving things that you can do. The other stuff around theology is to keep us mindful that our theology is far less important than the well-being of the person in front of us. Psychology, the needs of the individual, trump our need to be correct theologically, no matter which side of the theological divide you fall on. All right. That being said, we're going to move into postvention. I see something flashing. Is there a question?
Yep, it's a question. How do you balance that it is a community sin to not have prevented a death, and also how we keep boundaries and make promises that we can't keep?
We're not promising anybody anything, except that we are going to do our best to embody the love God has for every individual. We're going to do our best to have an affirming, open community that welcomes everyone as they are, that is working toward ending the silence around mental illness and suicidality, is trying to break the stigma by sharing stories, by allowing people to share their prayer requests, by removing the taboo about talking about mental illness and suicidality in the church. So our promise is that we will do our best to communicate and embody the love God has for everyone who comes through our doors or everyone we encounter. That's the only promise we're making. We're not promising that we can save every life, because people aren't always honest with us. We don't know what we don't know. If somebody doesn't tell you they're struggling with suicide, there's not much you can do about it. You increase the odds that they will tell you by talking about it, by being welcoming, by having the word suicide spoken from the pulpit, included in pastoral prayers, encouraging others to safely tell their own stories. But there is no promise.
Mandy, is that your question? I'm not
Yes.
sure that, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah, we are working toward the day when suicide is 100% preventable, because nobody's afraid to talk about it. But these days, fear of talking about it, the shame and is killing people, which is why we're here today, because we want to stop contributing to suicide deaths by our silence, our inability to talk about it in church. So when we come to postvention, ethics, safe messaging, and hope are what we focus on. Oops, now I go backwards. So we want to be mindful, as I've talked about, that our theology can be a protective factor for some and can be a risk factor for others. So that when we are talking with suicidal folks, our personal belief system does not matter. We have to resolve what I call the moral and ethical dilemma for ourselves in an authentic way. My response is to say that God is not a fan. If that works for you, you're welcome to take it. Or come up with some other way that is neutral ground, and so that you can assess risk factors and protective factors around belief system. And I think every clergy person of all faith traditions has to resolve their own theological thinking around suicide and suicidality in a way that is going to save lives, not in a way that could potentially contribute to suicide. So we need to be mindful of the protective factor and risk factors in our more traditional ways of theologically thinking. And we have a responsibility to minimize contagion. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. This is the language we use to talk about suicide. And I refer to that as safe messaging, which we'll get to in the next slide. And I've already talked about resolving the ethical dilemma. It's a lot of responsibility on clergy when we are talking with families who have had a suicide death or conducting memorial services for people who've died by suicide. It's a tremendous responsibility. Okay, so whenever we talk about suicide with a group of people, whether it's a youth group or a congregation gathered for a memorial service or just an educational event, we assume that at least one person in the room is actively thinking about suicide, which then keeps us mindful of what we say and how we say it. So safe messaging around suicide is essential. We don't see this in the media as much as I would like. These are the basics of safe messaging. First is language. We try to remove all language that implies judgment. Like, we try not to say committed suicide, because what do you commit? Crimes. So we want to try to say simply that they died by suicide, or some people make it a verb and say the person suicided. I find that awkward. So died by suicide. Take out the qualifiers. And when you're talking about people who engage in suicidal behavior, the way that most people still say it is attempted suicide. Attempt implies failure. And of course, as people looking on, we want the person who is suicidal to fail at suicide attempts. But if you are the person who is suicidal and you hear somebody say you had a failed suicide attempt, what goes through your brain more often than not is, I'll show you next time, I will succeed. So we try to remove those successful suicide, failed suicide attempt, try to take that out. I go one step further, and I don't even say attempt. I say engaged in suicidal behavior. Sometimes you can put the qualifier, potentially lethal suicidal behavior if it was, something that was nearly fatal. But I try to take out any, and this isn't just me, this is other folks. The engaged in suicidal behavior is just me. I haven't quite convinced my colleagues that this is the way we should talk about it, because it takes more words. And if you're writing chart notes, then it takes more words. But I think it's important to take out any language that implies a value judgment. Because what we want as people who are not suicidal is in direct conflict with what those who are suicidal want. So success or failure gets tangled up in ways that we don't need to compound it. So language is important. And never, ever, ever publicly disclose the means by which someone died by suicide. Is that another question?
I got two more questions. I was kind of waiting for you to just take a breath. Yep.
Okay.
First one, could you talk a little more about balancing the grief of a family in the aftermath of someone who has died from suicide, and the need to be conscious of the community's need for awareness, prevention, and safety of others, especially in the context of a memorial service with a large public awareness of the death? And then, do you want the second one now, or you want to do that one and I'll read you the second one?
We'll go with that one.
Okay.
Education is always important. Most of the time, education comes at the postvention time, because then we realize this is a problem that we need to address. And so education happens then. Whenever I work with families who've had someone die by suicide, I strongly encourage them to allow me to name suicide as the cause of death. Because the more we talk about it, the more we reduce shame and stigma. People don't want to talk about losing a loved one to suicide because they feel guilty and they feel shame. So the more we can alleviate that, the better. And I'm going to talk more about memorial services in a couple of minutes. So if we can hold on to the rest of that question and come back to it in a couple of minutes.
Okay, the second question is, in the language we use, I have heard the phrase completed suicide as a way of acknowledging the diagnosis of depression rather than a choice of action. Could you speak to that?
Again, completed suicide implies a value judgment that we don't really want. We don't want anyone to complete suicide. So if you say died by suicide, it's completed suicide. I don't think we need to do that. You can say someone who had a lifelong struggle with depression died by suicide. You can say it that way. And I have also seen it written as, person died from complications from a lifetime struggle with mental illness. That also implies suicide. I prefer to say it directly, but completed suicide is as fraught with difficulties as failed or successful, in my opinion. So we just try to remove the qualifiers. We all know what we mean by suicide or suicidal behavior. Okay. So I'm going to move on to means. I've touched on this a little bit. We never talk about the means. Don't talk about it with your colleagues. Don't talk about it with your family. Don't talk about it with your friends. If you happen to know the means by which someone died by suicide and you need to talk about it, find a trained professional, because one, vicarious trauma is real. And this is also another way that we increase contagion. Because as soon as you disclose the means by which someone died by suicide, you have disclosed a means that guarantees success. You don't want to do that. We saw after a couple summers ago when we had those 2 celebrities die by suicide and the means were disclosed, there was a bump in suicide rates after that happened. There was also a bump in teen suicide rates after 13 Reasons Why came out, because they had that very explicit suicide scene, which they have since taken out. That show also did a ton of other things that were high risk for youth who are already at risk. So never disclose the means. If you hear in a news report or see in the newspaper that the media is reporting the means by which someone died by suicide, write a letter to the editor, do anything you can to get them to not do that again. It's essential. And I think, again, we need to be aware of the protective factors and risk factors around our own personal theology. We want to increase the protective factors by offering hope, healing, and affirming the value of human life without making any promises. That's the tricky part. You happen to have in New Hampshire one of, I think, the strongest postvention programs that I've seen. They have a great suicide loss survivors network. It's the Connect program. The web address is right here. They've now gone national, but they are absolutely amazing. Great resources. They were among the first to try to put together resources for clergy. So check them out. All right. Is that another question?
Another question. How do you recommend handling uncertainty of intent? A friend in law enforcement has dealt with numerous deaths by overdose in which it wasn't clear whether the overdose was death by suicide or accident. He wrestles with what to tell families, and I know clergy who have had similar concerns.
Yeah, that's a hard one. In my personal opinion, if someone is struggling with addiction, there is no difference between accidental overdose and suicide, because addiction on that level is a form of suicide, because you play Russian roulette every time you use. So you can simply name it as overdose when you're talking with family, but there's a fine line there. And I know there's confusion in reporting all over the place with that. You know, is it accidental overdose? Was it intentional overdose? You know, do we know? Most of the time we don't know. So naming it as suicide is not wrong. But people are still experience so much shame around suicide. They may have less shame around accidental overdose. I don't know, because drug addiction also brings a fair amount of shame with it. It's a judgment call for whoever it is you're talking with. I'm sorry, there's not a clear answer to that. I err on the side of suicide when it's a drug overdose with someone who struggled with addiction. Okay. Safe messaging examples. We've talked about these. This is kind of a review. For those who are thinking about suicide, we can remind them that God is not a fan of suicide and would rather they find another way to resolve their the psychiatric pain they're in. Let's talk about why you're feeling what you're feeling. Are there ways we can get you more help? You know, we know that medical treatment, antidepressants, and work for a very large percentage of patients. There's also other forms of treatment, social engagement, social supports, church, belonging to a group where you feel a sense of community. There's lots of things we can help people do to have a multi-pronged approach to wellness and recovery. But if they're caught up in that heaven or hell dilemma, they're not thinking about how to resolve the pain in another way. So introducing the idea that God is not a fan could get them thinking in a different way about resolving the pain they're in. We can also say that we don't know whether God is merciful or God is not merciful. We'd like to believe God is merciful, but we honestly don't know. And again, I don't care what you actually think you know. It's not important right now. What's important is saving that life. And so you want to reiterate that, can we find another way for you to deal with the pain you're in that would be more clearly pleasing to God? These sound sort of simplistic, but they're not. They are truly life-saving, because you're acknowledging that the person is in pain. You're also somewhat acknowledging that they don't actually want to die. They want the pain to end. So focusing, I hear you. I hear that you're in pain. You want to validate that. And, there are other ways to relieve that psychiatric pain. All right. So, memorial service. There's a whole section in the book that has recommendations for memorial service, but here are some of the basics. If you have permission to name suicide as the cause of death, do that. Do not disclose the means. And also talk about the whole person. You talk about the things they did well, the things they enjoyed, the people who loved them. You talk about the way they contributed to the community. You give the fuller picture. You acknowledge, if you know that they struggled with a mental health challenge, they died by suicide. But you don't focus primarily on the suicide, nor do you ignore it. So another reason that I strongly encourage families to allow me to name suicide as the cause of death, because the more we can talk about it, even in a memorial service, the more likely we are to save lives. Because if there's someone at that memorial service who's thinking about suicide, they may come to you and say, I'm thinking about suicide, what do I do? I see a question, or that we have one.
Nope, that's me. We got some people who are not muted. I hear like some kind of background noise competing with you.
Gotcha. So if you are not on mute, could you mute yourself? All right. Then if we're preaching, which is always a tricky business at a service for suicide, you want to stress that God values all human life. There is hope for all of humanity. The way that I often put that is, where there is breath, there is hope. Meaning, if you're alive, we can help you. There is possibility for your future. But really stressing that the value God has for all human life. I often use Psalm 139 as a text for a sermon for someone who's died by suicide, because that clearly communicates the value that God places on individual human life. There's no place we can go where God is not, that God is with us in the depths of pain. So you can assure people that though their loved one who died by suicide felt alone, utterly and completely, God was still there with them in the pain. And the other thing is, if you have printed resources, if you print a bulletin, if you print a prayer card, if you print anything, make sure you print the national hotline on it and any local suicide prevention resources you have.
And actually, a little bit earlier in the chat window, Ruth was kind enough to drop the suicide prevention hotline number in the chat window with their website. So
perfect.
If you scroll up a little bit, it's right there for you.
Perfect. Okay. So it's important, clearly, to pay attention to what you say and what you do. Remember, we are to be saving lives, not contributing to death. The body of Christ has no business contributing to someone's death. So being attentive to the language we use, how we say it, and to whom we say it matters. I can't stress this enough. If you walk away from here with nothing else, take this with you. What you say and what you do matters. You also have an obligation to resolve the ethical dilemma of where you personally fall on the, is suicide a sin? Do you go to heaven? Do you go to hell? What does God respond? How does God respond? But remember that your obligation to contribute to saving lives outweighs any personal theology you may come to conclude. That is also a challenge often for clergy to hear, that your personal theology, your personal belief system in the midst of a psychiatric crisis matters less than saving the life of the person in front of you. It's another thing that I can't stress enough, because we feel this pressure to share the theology that makes the most sense to us, the pressure that we think is right theology. And we are quick to criticize our more conservative siblings because we don't agree with their right theology, but we are just as wrong when we do the same thing. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're pushing heaven or pushing hell. When a person's life is at risk, that's the wrong thing to do. Suicide can be prevented. And as I said, we work toward the day when all suicide is preventable. Safe messaging, being mindful of what we say, how we say it, to whom we say it, goes a long way in establishing that. All right. I know that I threw a lot of things at you. Some of it might be new information, maybe a lot of it. I want to check in, see where folks are at. We just did that very quickly, and you might need to take a breath. Questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
New Hampshire is working, well, there are people in New Hampshire that are working towards getting the death with dignity law approved in the state. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. My feeling is that I believe people have a right to end misery if it's a medical issue. Like, if I were to find out I had Lou Gehrig's disease, I don't think I'd want to live to the end of that. But I was at a hearing for it not too long ago, and the bulk of the people that were against it all believe that it is state-sanctioned suicide.
Sure. That's where our puritanical precept once again gets in the way of doing what might be best for individual human beings, because we want to see things as either or. If you know, we allow assisted suicide for people who have chronic physical illness, you know, they live in chronic pain, or they're facing a horrible death, then people say, well, that's suicide and we shouldn't do it. I will tell you very simply where I fall on that. My mother died from COPD 5 years ago. About 6 weeks before she died, she told me she didn't know if she could take any more. She didn't know if she could deal with it because she knew the kind of death she was likely to die. So I told her, I said, do you know that prescription that hospice brings you every 2 weeks? She's like, yeah. I said, take it. If you're sure you're done, just take it. And she was on the autism spectrum. So she's like, I don't know how much to take. I'm like, if you're really done, you take it all. So that tells you where I fall on this. Because I don't believe someone choosing to end their life because they have a fatal illness that is only going to get worse is very different than someone killing themselves to end psychiatric pain. Very different. The other question that often comes up is suicide among the elderly, you know, people 80 plus, because that is also on the rise. And again, there's a difference in what's going on. If you're talking with someone who's 80 or older and depressed, then you address the depression and you get them help for those suicidal thoughts, because depression can be alleviated to a greater or a lesser extent in most human beings. Now, if this person who's 80 plus is also suffering from acute whatever that causes physical pain every moment of every day, and there's no hope of that ever getting better, that's a different kind of thought about suicide. Do you see the difference?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I realize we all have an obligation to resolve these kinds of questions for ourselves, and there isn't a clear right or wrong answer. I tend to look at these things as case by case, and I do personally wish that more states allowed for death with dignity.
Yep, I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, it's and it's hard, and if you don't agree, you're not wrong. There's a case to be made on either side. Having sat on more than one ethics committee at a hospital, most of the cases that come to the ethics committee are palliative care. At what point do you stop doing anything other than offering pain meds? Usually the family member, like I remember one case where there was a woman over the age of 90 who had a pacemaker, and she didn't want her batteries to be replaced because she wanted to be able to die a natural death. And her family insisted that she have the batteries replaced. And so it comes to the ethics committee. And I was just like, she shouldn't have to have her batteries replaced at over 90. If that's what's keeping her alive, it's her choice. And we have no idea how long those batteries will last. I know. Yeah, go ahead.
Question in the chat window. Should we call it physician-assisted suicide, movement, legislation, etc., suicide, or something else? I heard you.
I think we should.
Death with dignity is what I heard you just say.
Yeah, death with dignity is my preferred statement because it separates the issue of suicide. There were many patients that I worked with when I worked at New Hampshire Hospital who had signed DNRs because they thought that if they engaged in suicidal behavior and EMS came, EMS wouldn't revive them. It doesn't work that way. You know, if you have a DNR and you're in a car accident, they're going to do what they can because the car accident has nothing to do with your cancer or whatever all else. So it's not that cut and dry. There's a lot of room for interpretation. There's a lot of leeway, which is why I say we take it on a case-by-case basis. Because if death with dignity becomes a thing, there has to be somebody who decides. There has to be a team of people that debate the ethics of allowing this person versus that person to die with dignity. You know, it's messy, and there's no clear-cut right answer. It's something that we should all continue to wrestle with. And yet, I err on the side of compassion. If there's no hope for healing, there's no hope for a cure, there's no hope for improved quality of life, I'm not going to say no. In fact, if it's within my capacity, I'll tell you how to do it for yourself. And to this day, I honestly don't know if my mother did or didn't. She lived another 6 or 8 weeks after she and I had that conversation, and she died in her sleep. So I have no idea. I don't need to know. So, you know, and palliative care these days is pretty good with, you know, when someone is no longer able to have any quality of life, they usually administer pain meds to keep them comfortable, often sedated to the point of unconsciousness until they die. So that's a sort of reasonable middle ground before we get the death with dignity in place. But it's hard. And there's a lot of faith traditions that are absolutely against it. So the more legalistic your faith tradition is, the more likely you are to be against any kind of laws about this.
So coming back to kind of where we were, another question, can you speak more about how we engage someone to find out their theological viewpoint so we can determine how we should respond to their theological needs?
I usually just ask. I am more direct than the average person. So I usually just ask. If somebody says, you know, if I've had this conversation with someone and they're thinking about suicide, I will say to them, what do you think God's view of suicide is? What are your thoughts on that? And does it matter to you? Because they could say, I don't care what God thinks. It's a distinct possibility. Even people in our churches may not care what God thinks because, you know, most people are filled with a healthy amount of doubt about whether there is God, even those who sit in our pews on a regular basis, including we ourselves. So, ask that question, and then you can sort of play around with it. If they say, I don't think I really care what God thinks, but, I've heard that you go to hell, and, my life is hellacious enough. So how could it be that different if I die by suicide and I go to hell? Well, what would it be like if you thought maybe you wouldn't go to hell? Like, what if God actually loves you enough to not send you to hell? Would that change how you're living now? You can just ask the what if questions, depending on the answers you get. Is there another way that you think of that you could look at that? If somebody says, I'm absolutely going to hell and I don't care, is there another way to look at that? If they're absolutely going to hell and that keeps them from dying by suicide, then leave it alone. But, ask the what if questions. Ask, is there a possibility that you can look at this a different way? Do you see any other solution to the pain that you're in? Can you imagine that there is another solution to the pain that you're in? Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
When I was working as a therapist, I realized today I resolved my own ethical issue by helping people who were survivors of suicides of friends or people in their family wade through the rest of their lives carrying that. And I was just going to ask to what degree there is a common misperception of people who are thinking about suicide that their families, their friendship groups, the world will be better off without them. And over the years, I built up, huge amounts of evidence to the contrary. Yep. Do you think it's ever helpful to try to work with people around correcting that misperception if someone is feeling suicidal?
It can be helpful depending on the relationship you have with the individual. And you have to be very careful because sometimes it adds a sense of pressure. Because the person who's suicidal does not believe that they are worthy of love, that they are lovable, that they contribute anything positive to the world, the great deceiver of depression. And so if you're saying, but your spouse will miss you, your spouse will never get over this loss, they have trouble even taking that in. Or your parents will never, ever get over this loss. Because my friends, there is no greater pain on this planet than a parent who loses a child to suicide at any point in life. There is no greater pain. I have not seen anything worse, anything more difficult to come to terms with than parents who lose their children to suicide. It's hard enough for siblings, for relatives, for spouses, for friends, but parents have the worst time of it. But it could be, depending on the relationship of trust you have with that person, you could raise the issue. Is it possible that other people see you differently than you see yourself right now? Is that even remotely possible? In my own days, I questioned anybody who said they loved me, mostly because my early experiences of parental love were confusing at best. But if someone said they loved me, I immediately thought two things. One, you don't know me. And two, what the hell is wrong with you? Because depression distorts your capacity to see your own value, to experience relationships that are built on love and trust. So you have to tread carefully so you don't add more pressure to the person who's already feeling a fair amount of pressure. But I like the is it possible kinds of questions. And if you don't have a solid relationship with the individual, you might want to leave that question to a therapist who builds a relationship of trust that is a little different than a pastor-parishioner relationship. But only you can know the level of trust you already have in a relationship with a parishioner. Other questions?
So we're due to go back into breakout rooms.
Mm-hmm.
We're running a little late.
Yep.
Do you want to shorten which part?
We'll shorten the report back part.
Okay.
Yep. So we'll give people a full half hour in breakout room.
Cool. I'm going to send everybody back to the same rooms they were in because I feel like you've begun to establish some trust with each other.
Yep.
Rachel, you don't have to go back into a breakout room. Looks like Richard worked the last time. So if you want to sort of hang out in the normal room, that's up to you.
I'll
Okay.
go back into the room. It's
Cool.
good.
All right, here we go.